The Duke married his enemy's widow, then found her letter that changed everything. A marriage of convenience, a secret from 1813, a love that wasn't part of the plan. Octavian Montague married Isolde to claim a victory over his late enemy. He thought she was complicit in his brother's death, until he found the letter she never sent. In this gripping Regency tale, two broken souls must decide if they are bound by a contract or by a love that is finally ready to bloom. The clock in the blue drawing room had stopped at 4:30 on an afternoon 11 years gone. Isolde knew this because she had memorized every detail of its brass face, the hairline crack in the enamel at 7, the tarnish creeping along the hour hand, the way dust had settled into the Roman numerals like grief into bone. She had studied it through 91 evenings of waiting for the Dowager Duchess to finish her inspection of the day's menus and release her with a nod that conveyed neither approval nor its opposite. 91 evenings, 91 frozen clocks, 91 nods. Tonight, the Dowager had requested her presence for dinner. Isolde smoothed the dark blue silk of her gown, not morning colours, not quite, but close enough to remind everyone what she was, the widow, the transaction. The woman who had married the Duke of Ashford in a ceremony witnessed by 4 people, none of whom had smiled. She had not expected smiles. She had expected survival, and survival she had received. What she had not expected was how much survival could feel like slow suffocation. Before this house, before this name, she had possessed a pianoforte with a sticky D-sharp that she had loved anyway. A garden plot no larger than a dining table, where she had grown roses that bloomed the color of sunset. A friend, one friend, who had written her letters full of underlined words and exclamation points, and the kind of gossip that made her laugh aloud. All of it surrendered when she had signed her name beside his. All of it left behind in a house that now belonged to creditors, to strangers, to anyone but her. She pressed her fingers briefly against the cool silk at her waist and felt nothing but fabric. The dining room at Ashford House could seat 40. Tonight, 3 places had been laid at one end of the mahogany expanse, the candelabras positioned to create an island of light in the surrounding dark. Isolde paused at the threshold, taking in the battlefield before she entered it. The Dowager Duchess sat at the head, silver hair pinned with the precision of a military campaign, her posture suggesting that comfort was a weakness she had never permitted herself. Beside her, in the chair that should have been empty, sat the Duke, Octavian, her husband, her tongue pressed against the roof of her mouth, the word refusing to form even in the silence of her own mind. He rose when she entered. The movement was automatic, trained into him by decades of propriety, and she watched his shoulders stiffen halfway through, a fractional pause, barely visible, before he completed the gesture anyway. His face gave nothing. Isolde. Her name left his mouth the way a man might handle a letter he wasn't certain he should open. My mother suggested we dine together this evening. Your mother, the Dowager said, is sitting directly beside you and can speak for herself. She gestured to the empty chair across from Octavian. Sit, child. The soup is cooling. Isolde sat. The footman ladled consommé into her bowl with the efficiency of a man who had learned to be invisible. She lifted her spoon. The silver was cold against her fingers. She set it down, lifted it again. The broth was the color of weak tea, and something in her throat had closed against the thought of swallowing. Across the table, Octavian was watching her. She felt his attention the way one felt a draught from an ill-fitted window. Impossible to see, impossible to ignore. The fine hairs at the back of her neck prickled. When she looked up, he looked away, his gaze dropping to his own untouched bowl. When she returned her eyes to her soup, she could feel him looking again. A weight, a heat, a question he would not ask aloud. Weeks of this. Weeks of doorways and glances, and the kind of quiet that filled a house where 2 people occupied the same address, but not the same life. She had learned the rhythm of his footsteps in the corridor outside her chambers, the creak of the 3rd stair that announced his passage. She had learned to be still when she heard it, to hold her breath until he passed, to pretend she did not notice that he sometimes paused, just for a moment, before continuing on. I trust the renovations to the East Wing are proceeding satisfactorily. The Dowager's voice cut through the quiet like scissors through silk. They are. Octavian's response was directed at his mother, though his eyes flickered briefly toward Isolde. The plasterer has completed the ceiling work. Another fortnight should see it finished. Excellent. And have you informed your wife which rooms she may claim for her use? Or does she remain confined to the yellow chambers like a well-dressed prisoner? The quiet that followed had edges. Isolde set down her spoon, with more care than the action required. "The yellow chambers suit me perfectly well, Your Grace." "Do they?" The dowager's pale eyes, the same unsettling shade as her son's, though colder, harder, fixed on Isolde with an attention that felt like being pinned to a board. "Then you are either easily satisfied or remarkably skilled at appearing so. I have not yet determined which." "Mother," Octavian's voice carried a warning. "I am merely making conversation." The dowager took a delicate sip of wine. "It is what civilized people do at dinner, though I confess I have had limited opportunity to observe the practice in this household of late. Your bride has perfected the art of answering questions without actually saying anything. It makes for dull mealtimes." Isolde's fingers curled against her palm, beneath the table, nails pressing into skin. "I was not aware that entertainment was among my duties, Your Grace." The dowager's mouth twitched. It could have been irritation. It could have been something else entirely. The girl has a tongue, after all. She turned to Octavian. "Did you know?" "I suspected." His voice was carefully measured, but his shoulders had loosened, a barely perceptible shift as though he had exhaled without meaning to. "She has always seemed capable of speech. She merely chooses not to exercise the capacity." "A wise policy," Isolde said, "in a house where one's words may be catalogued and examined for flaws." The dowager laughed. The sound was rusty, startled, as if it had surprised her as much as anyone. "Oh, she is sharp. How refreshing. I had begun to think you had married a portrait rather than a person." Octavian was looking at her now, actually looking, not the sideways glances she had grown accustomed to, but direct examination, as if she had become a text he needed to translate. His winter moss eyes held hers for one beat. "Two. I assure you," he said slowly, "I have always been aware that my wife is a person." The words hung in the air between them. Isolde's hand found the edge of the table, steadying herself against a sudden lightness in her chest. She did not trust it. She had stopped trusting lightness the morning she had woken in a strange bed as Lady Langley and understood that her old life was over. And yet, she looked down at her soup. It had gone cold. "If you will both excuse me," she said, rising. "I find I am not as hungry as I thought." She made it to the door before his voice stopped her. "Isolde." She turned. He was standing again, one hand resting on the back of his chair, his expression unreadable in the candlelight. The flames caught the sharp line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows that she had learned to recognize as thought rather than displeasure. "Tomorrow," he said. "The library. There are books I thought you might find of interest." It was not an apology. It was not an invitation. It was— she did not know what it was. She nodded once and left before her face could betray her. Behind her she heard the dowager's voice, dry and knowing. 3 months of glacial courtesy, and you offer her books. Truly, Octavian, your father's gift for romance has passed to you intact." And then, improbably, impossibly, the low rumble of his response. He was laughing. She had never heard him laugh before. The sound was rough at the edges, unpracticed, as though his throat had forgotten the shape of it. It lasted only a moment before it faded, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the house. Isolde pressed her palm flat against the cold plaster of the corridor wall, feeling the chill seep through her glove into her skin. She had been telling herself since the day she signed the marriage contract that wanting anything from this arrangement was foolishness. She had told herself that for 91 evenings. The telling had been convincing once. It was becoming less so. She buried the thought where it belonged and walked toward the yellow chambers alone, her footsteps echoing against marble that answered to no one. The library at Ashford House occupied the entirety of the north wing's ground floor, a cathedral of leather and dust where generations of Montague men had retreated from wives, creditors, and the demands of being observed. Octavian had not slept. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the reason, not Edmund's face in the grey dawn, not the weight of a dying brother in his arms, but the memory of dark blue silk and a woman who had looked at her soup as though it contained her execution. He had watched her. He had not meant to watch her. He had watched her anyway, cataloguing the angle of her jaw, the way her fingers had tightened on her spoon when his mother mentioned the yellow chambers, the flash of wit when she had spoken of the broken clock. 11 years is rather a long time to leave something broken, Your Grace. She had meant the clock. She had also, he suspected, meant something else entirely. He pulled another volume from the shelf without looking at the title. Philosophy. Tedious. He replaced it and moved deeper into the stacks, where the morning light struggled through windows that had not been cleaned since the previous century. The smell of aged paper and leather polish hung thick in the air, familiar as childhood, comforting as nothing else in this house had been for years. The book was on the third shelf from the bottom, pushed back as though someone had tried to hide it. Octavian would not have noticed it at all, except that it did not belong. The Ashford Library was organized with military precision, his grandfather's doing, maintained through 3 generations of increasingly indifferent heirs. This volume was slim, bound in faded green cloth and bore no title on its spine. He knew before he touched it that it was hers. His hand hovered over the cloth binding. He should leave it. He should walk away, return to his study, pour himself a brandy he would not drink before noon, and forget that he had ever seen it. He pulled it from the shelf. Meditations on Solitude, the title page read. A collection of essays for the contemplative mind, published in 1799. The kind of earnest philosophical volume that young women were encouraged to read and universally ignored in favor of novels. The pages fell open to a fold, not a bookmark, a letter, written in a hand he did not recognize, small, careful, the letters formed with the discipline of someone who had been taught penmanship as a moral virtue. He should not read it. He read it. November 14th, 1813. Mr. Montague, I write to you against every principle of propriety I possess, and I do so knowing that you will likely dismiss this letter as the ravings of a woman you have no reason to trust. I ask only that you read to the end before you consign these pages to the fire. Do not meet my husband tomorrow. I cannot tell you how I know of the duel, only that I do, and that I am begging you, as one stranger to another, to find some other way to settle whatever grievance lies between you. Lord Langley does not lose. He does not fight fairly. He does not, I have come to understand, fight at all. He simply arranges circumstances so that his opponent cannot win. You are young. You are, from what I have observed at the few gatherings where our paths have crossed, kind in the careless way of men who have not yet learned that kindness costs something. You spoke to me once at the Hartwell ball, when no one else would. You asked if I was well. I lied. You knew I lied. You did not press. I think of that moment more often than I should. Please find another way, retract the challenge, apologize, even if you have nothing to apologize for. Lord Langley will accept a public humiliation over a private victory. His pride requires witnesses. If you will not do this for yourself, consider your brother. Consider what it would mean to him to lose you over a debt and a woman neither of you should want. I am not that woman. I have never been. But I know how these stories end. And I cannot. The letter stopped there. The final line was crossed out so heavily that the pen had torn through the paper. Beneath it, in the same hand, smaller now, cramped with what could have been haste or despair. I did not send this. I should have sent this. I will carry the weight of not sending this for whatever remains of my life. God forgive me. God forgive us both. Octavian set the letter down. His hands had begun to shake. He noticed this distantly, as though observing someone else's body from a great remove. He picked up the letter again. The library had gone very still. Even the dust motes suspended in the weak morning light seemed to have frozen, waiting. She had known. She had tried to warn him. Edmund had died in the grey November dawn, bleeding out in Octavian's arms, while the surgeon arrived too late, and Lord Langley walked away without a scratch. And Isolde Langley, Isolde Whitmore, as she had been then, had written a letter that could have saved him. Had not sent it. Had carried it with her for 2 years through the remainder of a brutal marriage, through widowhood, through the humiliation of accepting a proposal from a man who looked at her like she was a debt to be collected. Had married Octavian anyway. He had assumed, everyone had assumed, that she married him because she had no choice. A widow with no fortune, no family willing to claim her, no options beyond the workhouse or worse. He had offered his name like a blade, a punishment dressed as charity, and she had accepted it with the quiet dignity of a woman walking to the gallows. But this letter suggested an entirely different story. Consider your brother. Consider what it would mean to him to lose you. She had known Edmund, had watched him at least well enough to observe kindness, had thought of him, more often than I should, in the private spaces of a brutal marriage, and she had married Octavian. Not because she had no choice, because she had hoped. The realization moved through him like a crack spreading through ice. He pressed his palm flat against the library table, feeling the cold wood beneath his skin, anchoring himself to a world that had shifted beneath his feet. He folded the letter with deliberate care, replaced it in the book, returned the book to the shelf, pushed back into its hiding place. Then he stood in the grey morning light of the Ashford Library, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of 6 generations of men who had understood nothing about the women they married, and allowed himself to feel, for the first time in 2 years, a fracture in the wall he had built around his grief. It was not forgiveness, it was not absolution, it was not even understanding. Not yet. It was the terrible, dawning recognition that he had constructed an entire narrative from assumption and rage. That the woman eating dinner across from him each evening, the woman who counted broken clocks and wore her composure like armor, had been carrying a weight as crushing as his own. That she had tried to save Edmund. That she had failed. That she had married the brother anyway, hoping, impossibly foolishly, to be known by the only other person in the world who understood what it meant to be destroyed by the same man. Octavian's throat tightened. He swallowed against it. He thought of her at dinner the night before, spine straight, eyes fixed on her plate, fielding his mother's barbs with a composure that never cracked. He thought of her fingers trembling on the stem of her wine-glass, just once, just slightly, when the dowager had mentioned the yellow chambers. He had watched her. He had not understood what he was seeing. He understood now, and the understanding changed everything. The book appeared on the escritoire in Isolde's sitting room without explanation. She discovered it Tuesday morning, placed atop her correspondence as though it had always been there, a slim volume bound in burgundy leather, its spine unmarked. She turned it over twice before opening to the title page, a catalogue of English garden design, 1750-1800 Chine, gardens. Her husband had left her a book about gardens. Isolde set it down, picked it up again, examined the binding for any inscription, any note tucked between pages. Nothing. Only the book itself, and the unmistakable fact that someone had entered her rooms while she slept and placed it where she would find it. A servant's error, surely. A misdirected delivery. The alternative, that Octavian Montague had thought of her, had chosen this volume with intention, had arranged for its placement, required a version of him she had no evidence existed. She considered that version anyway, through breakfast and her morning correspondence, and the long hours before luncheon when Ashford House stretched around her like a breath no one would release. She found him in the garden, not the formal parterre visible from the morning room, but the walled garden beyond the east wing, where the renovation noise drove away anyone seeking peace. Isolde had discovered it her second week at Ashford House, overgrown, neglected, magnificent in its wildness. She had assumed no one else remembered it existed. Octavian stood at the far wall, his back to her, examining the climbing roses that had long since overwhelmed their supports. His coat was absent. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow. There was dirt on his forearms and a smear of something green across his knuckles. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, like a man rather than a monument. "Your Grace." He turned. Whatever expression had occupied his features vanished so quickly she caught only its edge, a softness perhaps, or simply surprise. In its place, the familiar stillness, the composed assessment, but his sleeves remained rolled, and that small impropriety seemed to unsettle them both. "Lady Ashford." He did not move toward her, did not move away. "You've discovered my hiding place. I discovered it weeks ago. You've discovered mine." "Ah." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "A territorial dispute. I am prepared to negotiate terms." The words emerged before she could stop them. Light, almost teasing, nothing like the careful exchanges they had conducted at dinner tables under his mother's observation. His gaze sharpened. "Are you—" The air between them shifted. Isolde registered it in the way her breath shortened, in the sudden awareness of how far they stood from the garden gate, from witnesses, from safety. She should not have come here. She should not have spoken to him as though they were people who spoke to each other. "The book," she said instead of leaving. "On my escritoire. You received it then." "Was I intended to?" "That depends." He began rolling his sleeves down, each fold deliberate, each motion buying time she suspected he needed. "Did you find it presumptuous?" "I found it confusing. Those are not mutually exclusive." Isolde's arms crossed before she could stop them. A protective gesture she had trained herself to abandon years ago. Langley had mocked her for it. "Arms down, my dear. You look like a shopkeeper's wife expecting trouble." Octavian's gaze tracked the movement, but he said nothing, simply waited, as though her discomfort were information he was collecting. "Why gardens?" she demanded. "You stare at them." "I beg your pardon? From the yellow chambers, from the breakfast room, from every window you pass." His voice remained level, factual, as though reporting weather observations. "You stare at the gardens as though you expect them to tell you something important." Isolde's throat closed around whatever she had meant to say next. She had not realized anyone was watching. She had not realized he was watching. This man who had spent 91 days ensuring they occupied the same house without ever occupying the same room. "Perhaps I simply find the view preferable to the alternatives. Perhaps." He finished with his sleeves and stood facing her, his expression offering nothing. "Or perhaps you spent 5 years in a house without gardens and have not yet stopped being hungry for green things." The accuracy of it struck like a hand against her sternum. Langley's townhouse had been fashionable, expensive, entirely devoid of growing things. He had considered gardens vulgar, too rural, too common, too much evidence that nature existed beyond his control. She had dreamed sometimes of moss, of rain on leaves, of anything alive that did not require her to be dead inside to survive. "You know nothing about what I spent 5 years doing." "No," Octavian agreed. "I don't." There was a door opening in those words, where she had expected only walls. Isolde did not trust it. "If you wish to discuss horticulture, Your Grace, you might have simply asked me at dinner, though I understand your attendance at that meal is somewhat unreliable." His jaw tightened. Finally, a visible reaction, finally proof that the marble could crack. "My attendance has been strategic." Strategic. She let the word hang between them, watched it settle into the overgrown roses and the crumbling stone wall. What an elegant way to say cowardly. The quiet that followed was vast. Isolde heard her own pulse in her ears, heard the distant rhythm of workmen in the east wing, heard a sparrow rustling somewhere in the climbing roses that had brought him here. When Octavian spoke again, his voice had dropped to something that scraped against her composure. "You think me a coward. I think you arranged a marriage for reasons you have never explained, installed me in your household like furniture you hadn't quite decided where to place, and then spent weeks pretending I don't exist." She heard herself speaking, and could not stop. "I think you look at me when you believe I cannot see and then vanish the moment I might actually speak to you. I think—" She stopped, drew breath, forced her voice level. "I think cowardice would be a simpler explanation than the alternatives." Octavian took one step toward her, then another. He stopped close enough that she could see the variations in his eyes, layered, storm-colored, entirely too intent on her face. What alternatives? She should step back. She should apologize. She should remember every lesson she had learned about provoking powerful men in enclosed spaces, every bruise that had taught her to make herself small. "I don't know yet," she said instead. "But you left me a book about gardens, Your Grace, which suggests that you don't know either." For one impossible moment, his expression fractured. She watched him reach for words, watched his hand rise slightly, as though he meant to touch her arm, watched him stop himself with visible effort. Then the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path, a gardener perhaps, or a servant seeking one of them, and Octavian stepped back, his expression sealing shut like a letter she would never be permitted to read. "Enjoy the catalogue," he said, and walked past her without touching her, though she felt his passage in the displacement of warm September air, in the scent of turned earth and something sharper beneath it, like crushed herbs, or regret. She stood alone in the walled garden for a long time after, her arms still crossed against a cold that had nothing to do with the season, and wondered what question he had almost asked. Wondered, too, why she had wanted him to ask it. The ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles, their light catching crystal and gold, until the air itself seemed gilded. Isolde stood at the edge of the crowd, her copper hair pinned severely beneath a spray of seed pearls, her gown the color of midnight, dark enough to satisfy morning's shadow, fitted enough to remind society she was no longer technically required to wear it. She had not wanted to come. Octavian's hand rested at the small of her back, a gesture that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. The pressure was light, correct, what a husband owed a wife at a public function. She could feel the heat of his palm through silk and stays, and she hated herself for noticing. "The Ashworths have outdone themselves," she murmured, because someone needed to speak. "They always do." His breath stirred the hair at her temple. "Lady Ashworth believes excess is a form of virtue." A laugh escaped her before she could catch it. Sharp, surprised, entirely inappropriate. Two matrons nearby turned to stare. Octavian's fingers twitched against her spine. Not a caress. Closer to acknowledgement. "Careful," he said low. "You'll ruin your reputation for perfect composure." "I was not aware I had one. I have several." He steered her toward the refreshment table with the kind of social grace that looked effortless and was not. Most of them invented by people who have never spoken to you. She wanted to ask which reputations he meant. She wanted to ask what reputation he had invented for her, in those first weeks before the walled garden, before the book, before he started appearing in rooms she occupied and pretending he had business there. She asked none of it. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and Isolde felt the shift in the room's attention. Dozens of gazes tracking toward them with the hunger of people who had placed wagers on whether the Duke of Ashford would dance with his enemy's widow. Octavian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We should, for your grace." A man materialized at her elbow, his smile too wide, his bow too deep. Blonde hair swept fashionably across his forehead, and his eyes, a commonplace blue, moved over Isolde with an appreciation that made her skin prickle. "Forgive the intrusion. Lord Harrington at your service. I believe we were introduced at the Pembroke's musicale, though you may not recall." She did not recall. She had spent the Pembroke's musicale counting the minutes until she could leave. "Lord Harrington." She offered her hand because refusing it would cause a scene. He took it, held it a fraction too long, released it only when Octavian shifted his weight in a manner that was not quite a threat. "I wondered," Harrington continued, his attention fixed on Isolde as though her husband were furniture, "if you might honor me with this waltz, assuming, of course, the Duke can spare you." The question was an insult dressed in courtesy. Everyone knew a husband could not reasonably refuse such a request without appearing jealous or controlling. Everyone also knew that Lord Harrington had been one of her first husband's closest friends, had sat at Langley's card tables, laughed at Langley's jokes, and watched Isolde navigate her marriage with the detached amusement of a man observing a play he found mildly entertaining. She felt Octavian go rigid beside her. "I'm afraid," he began. "I would be delighted," Isolde heard herself say. Octavian's head turned. Those winter moss eyes, neither green nor brown, unreadable in the candlelight, fixed on her with an intensity that stole her breath. She did not know why she had accepted. She did not know why the flash of darkness in Octavian's expression made her want to both flee and stay rooted to this spot forever. Harrington offered his arm. She took it. The waltz carried her away from her husband and into the arms of a man who had once watched her flinch from Langley's touch and done absolutely nothing. "You look well," Harrington murmured as they turned. His hold was correct but proprietary, his thumb pressing too firmly against her gloved palm. "Widowhood suits you, or perhaps it's remarriage. Ashford seems attentive. He is my husband. He is your second husband." The correction carried weight. One might wonder how a woman moves so quickly from one duke's shadow to another's. The old Isolde, the Isolde who had survived 5 years of Langley, would have smiled blandly and changed the subject, would have swallowed the insult like medicine, familiar and bitter. But the weeks at Ashford House had done something to her defences. The walled garden, the book on her escritoire, the way Octavian had admitted, without apology, that he noticed her watching windows. "One might also wonder," she replied, her tone perfectly pleasant, "why a man who was so devoted to Lord Langley now seeks to dance with his widow, unless devotion was always merely convenience." Harrington's rhythm faltered. His grip tightened. "Langley told me about you," he said softly, "about your difficulties, your tendencies toward ingratitude. I always thought he was too generous with you." The warmth drained from her face. "He mentioned once that you wrote letters you shouldn't have, tried to interfere in matters beyond your understanding." Harrington smiled, genial and cold. "I wonder if Ashford knows what kind of woman he's married, if he's found your little secrets yet." The music swelled. The room spun. Isolde kept her face perfectly composed, 5 years of practice, 5 years of survival, but her mind raced with a single, terrible realization. Langley had known about the letter. If Langley had known, Langley had told others. And if Harrington knew, the waltz ended. Isolde stepped back from her partner with a curtsy that cost her everything she had. "Thank you for the dance, Lord Harrington." She turned. Octavian stood where she had left him, a glass of champagne untouched in his hand. His attention had not wavered from her for the entire 3 minutes. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the white-knuckled grip on the crystal stem, but standing beside him, one elegant hand resting on his forearm with the casual possessiveness of long intimacy, was a woman Isolde did not recognize, dark-haired, exquisite, laughing at what Octavian had apparently said. He was not laughing back, but he was not pulling away either. Isolde's feet carried her forward, one step, another. The crowd parted, or perhaps she only imagined they did, until she stood close enough to catch the scent of jasmine and bergamot that clung to the woman's perfect skin. Octavian's eyes met hers. The woman followed his look and smiled, slow, knowing, triumphant. "Ah," she said, her accent faintly continental. "The new Duchess. I have heard so much about you." She extended her hand as though greeting a servant. "I am Lady Catherine Ashworth, your husband's former betrothed." The words landed like a slap delivered with a smile. Isolde took the offered hand. She did not flinch. She did not look at Octavian. She had learned in her first marriage that looking at a man for rescue only revealed how little rescue was coming. "Lady Catherine," her voice emerged steady, colourless. "How fortunate that we should meet at your family's own ball. You must feel quite at home." A flicker of irritation crossed Catherine's beautiful face, there and gone, quick as a candle guttering. "I always do." She withdrew her hand, let her fingers trail across Octavian's sleeve as she did. "The Ashworths and the Montagues have been close for many years, but then you would not know that. Your own connections lie elsewhere." The implication was clear. "You are an outsider. You married into this world. I was born to it." Octavian shifted. His hand found Isolde's elbow, not the small of her back this time, but her elbow, as though steadying her for a blow he expected to land. "Lady Catherine was just remarking on the orchestra," he said. His tone was pleasant, distant, the voice of a man conducting necessary business. "She finds the second violinist flat." "Do I?" Catherine laughed, a sound like crystal ringing. "I don't recall saying so, but then you always did know my thoughts before I spoke them, Octavian. Some intimacies never quite fade." Isolde felt her chest tighten. Not jealousy. She refused to name it jealousy, but awareness. A sharpening of every sense, every nerve, until she could feel the heat of Octavian's body beside her like a fire she had not meant to stand so close to. She thought of the letter, of Harrington's smile, of all the secrets circling this ballroom like sharks beneath glittering water. "You must excuse me," she heard herself say. "I find I need air." She pulled her arm free before Octavian could tighten his grip, turned, walked toward the terrace doors with the measured pace of a woman who was not fleeing, absolutely not fleeing, merely seeking a moment's respite from the heat of too many candles. Behind her she heard Catherine's laugh again, bright, delighted, victorious. The terrace was cold, the November air sharp enough to cut. Isolde gripped the stone balustrade and stared out at the darkened gardens, her breath forming small clouds that dissolved into nothing. Former betrothed. She had not known. In all her careful research before accepting Octavian's proposal, the weeks of weighing risks and alternatives, of calculating whether his protection was worth his proximity to everything she had lost, no one had mentioned a former betrothal. But then why would they? She had been Langley's widow, desperate and debt-ridden. The Tun did not share its secrets with women in her position. The Tun watched women like her and waited for them to fall. Footsteps behind her, heavy, deliberate. She knew them without turning. "You'll catch your death." Octavian's voice, closer than she expected. "Perhaps." She did not look at him. "But at least I'll catch it in peace." A pause. Then, unexpectedly, "She means nothing. I did not ask." "No, you wouldn't." He moved to stand beside her at the balustrade, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, far enough that they did not touch. "The betrothal ended 2 years ago. Before Edmund. Before—" He stopped. Started again. "Before everything. Before your brother died at my husband's hand. Before you married the widow of the man who killed him. Before we began this performance that neither of us knows how to end. Why did it end?" She had not meant to ask. The question emerged of its own volition, dragged out by the cold and the dark and the memory of Catherine's fingers trailing across his sleeve. Octavian was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of its usual careful distance. "Because I discovered she had accepted my suit while conducting an affair with another man, a married man." A breath. "I ended it the same week Edmund challenged Langley, By the time Catherine's letters of apology arrived, I had buried my brother and lost all interest in explanations. Isolde absorbed this, filed it away alongside everything else she had learned about the man she had married, the small kindnesses, the careful distances, the way he had held her letter in the library and said nothing for days. She seems to believe there is unfinished business between you. There is not. And yet you stood beside her, let her touch you. She heard the edge in her own voice and hated it, hated the weakness it betrayed, hated most of all that she could not seem to stop herself from speaking. Octavian turned. She felt his gaze on her profile like a physical weight. "I was waiting for you," he said quietly. "Watching you dance with a man who has no business touching you. A man who—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "What did Harrington say to you?" The change of subject was abrupt, intentional. She understood suddenly that he had seen more than she realized, that his stillness across the ballroom had not been indifference. Nothing. The study door stood open. Isolde noticed this from the end of the corridor, where she had been walking without destination, a habit she had developed in her first marriage and never managed to abandon. Movement made her feel less visible. Stillness invited attention, but the study door stood open, and lamplight spilled across the hallway carpet in a thin golden stripe. And she knew, with the certainty of prey that has learned to recognize the hunter's territory, that he was inside. She should turn back, should retreat to the yellow chambers and their careful, impersonal comfort, should do any of the sensible things she had spent 5 years learning to do. She walked toward the light instead. He was standing at the window, his back to the door, one arm braced against the frame. The lamp on his desk burned low, casting amber shadows across the mahogany. Papers lay scattered across the blotter. Correspondence, she thought, though she could not see the contents from where she stood in the doorway. "Your Grace." He did not turn. "Lady Ashford," the title caught somewhere between them, belonging to neither, claimed by both. "The hour is late," she said. A meaningless observation. She made it anyway. "It is." He turned then, and the lamplight caught the angles of his face, the sharp line of his jaw, the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of nights as restless as her own. His coat was gone. His cravat hung loose, the knot half undone, and his waistcoat was unbuttoned. She had never seen him so incomplete. "You are not sleeping," she said. "Neither are you." The observation hung between them. Isolde remained in the doorway, unwilling to cross the threshold uninvited. The proprieties were absurd. This was her home now, such as it was, but absurdity had never stopped her from clinging to the forms that kept her anchored. "I found your letter." The words landed like stones dropped into glass. Isolde's spine went rigid before she could stop the reaction, her fingers curling into the fabric of her wrapper, and she watched him notice, watched him catalogue the response and file it away behind that unreadable mask he wore so well. "I do not—" "Do. November 14th, 1813. His tone remained level, conversational, as though they were discussing the weather or the state of the roads or any of the 1,000 meaningless topics that filled the conversations of people who had nothing to say to each other. "Addressed to my brother, hidden in a book you placed in my library, though you must have known I would find it eventually." Isolde's knees threatened to buckle. She locked them through sheer determination, her hand finding the doorframe. "I did not think you would look." Her voice emerged steadier than she had any right to expect. "The book was obscure. I chose it for that reason, because no one would—" "I look at everything." He moved away from the window and she tracked his progress across the room with the hyper-awareness of a woman who had learned to anticipate violence. He stopped at the desk, lifted a folded paper she had not noticed among the others. "You tried to warn him." Not a question, a statement of fact, stripped of inflection, demanding nothing. "Yes, you knew what Langley was. Yes, you knew Edmund would lose." Isolde closed her eyes. The memory rose unbidden, her hand trembling as she wrote, the ink blotting because she pressed too hard. The desperate hope that if she could just make him understand. "I knew your brother was not a man who had ever needed to fight unfairly." She opened her eyes, made herself meet his gaze. "I knew my husband was not a man who had ever fought any other way." The lamp flickered. Neither of them moved. Somewhere in the house a clock marked the quarter hour, not the broken one in the morning room, but its functioning cousin in the hall below. Why did you not send it? The question she had been asking herself for 4 years. The question that woke her at night, that crept into every quiet moment, that had followed her from Langley's townhouse to this gilded prison she had entered willingly. "Because I was afraid." The truth tasted like ash. "Because Langley found me writing it, and I told him it was a letter to my sister. And he believed me, or pretended to believe me, which amounted to the same thing. And because by the time I could have tried again it was already the 15th of November, and I told myself it was too late. She watched him process this, watched the tiny movements of his jaw, the way his fingers tightened on the letter's edge until the paper creased. It would have made no difference, he said. It could have saved his life. Edmund was proud, stubborn. He would not have withdrawn from a challenge based on the warning of a woman he barely knew. Then why does it matter? The question escaped before she could trap it. Why tell me you found it if it would have changed nothing? He set the letter down, crossed the room in 3 strides that brought him close enough for her to catch the scent of brandy and ink and wool warmed by skin, and she hated that she could identify it, hated that she had catalogued it without intending to. Because you tried. His voice dropped low enough that she had to lean closer to hear it. Because you risked his anger to save a stranger. Because you have been carrying this for 4 years, and I have been treating you as though you were complicit in what your husband did, and I was wrong. Isolde's throat worked. She had prepared herself for accusations, for cold fury, for the quiet, devastating dismissal she had learned to expect from men who believed themselves wronged. She had not prepared for this. I did not marry you for protection. The confession spilled out before she could stop it. I did not marry you because I had no choice, or because your solicitor made the arrangement sound reasonable, or because the alternative was worse. He was watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle, that made her aware of the thin cotton of her wrapper and the loose fall of her hair, waiting. I married you because you spoke to me at the Hartwell ball when no one else would, because you asked if I was well, and when I lied, you did not press me for a different answer. Her voice cracked on the final word. She kept going anyway. I married you because I thought, foolishly impossibly, that if anyone could understand what it meant to be destroyed by the same man, it would be you. The study fell into a stillness so complete she could hear the lamp oil hissing in its reservoir. And now? He asked. Isolde looked at him, really looked, past the controlled mask and the rigid posture and the careful distance he maintained like a fortress wall. Looked at the exhaustion carved into the lines around his mouth and the tension knotting his shoulders and the way his fingers had curled at his sides as though he were restraining himself from reaching for anything at all. Now, she said, I do not know what I think. He took one step closer, then another, close enough that she could see the flecks of brown in those changeable eyes, the faint scar above his left eyebrow she had never noticed before, the place where his jaw tightened against words he was not saying. I believe you, he said. 3 words. They should not have meant so much. They should not have cracked open the thing inside her chest that she had thought permanently sealed. Why? His mouth curved, not quite a smile, not quite anything she could name. Because you are the worst liar I have ever met, Lady Ashford, and because I have spent these weeks watching you, and I have never once seen you do anything for your own benefit. Isolde did not know who moved first. She only knew that the distance between them had narrowed to the width of a held breath, to the space where possibility hummed like a plucked string, and that his fingers had come to rest, barely, against the back of her wrist. The touch burned through her glove like a brand. This was not part of the arrangement, she whispered. No. His thumb traced a slow arc across her pulse point. It was not. The lamp guttered. In the half-darkness that followed, Isolde heard him exhale, a sound that carried the weight of surrender, or perhaps its dangerous cousin. She did not pull away. The morning after their confrontation, Isolde found documentation spread across the breakfast table where her toast should have been. Ledgers, correspondence, a solicitor's seal she did not recognize pressed into burgundy wax on no fewer than 7 envelopes, all opened, all addressed to the Duke of Ashford regarding the estate of the late Lord Langley. She stood in the doorway of the breakfast room, her hand still on the frame, and understood with terrible clarity what she was seeing. He had been investigating, not her, or not only her, the debts, the tangled mess of Langley's finances that had forced her into this arrangement in the first place, the shame she had carried for 2 years, the weight of owing everything to a man who had married her for reasons she still did not fully understand. Octavian entered behind her. She heard his footsteps pause. You were not meant to see those yet. Yet. The word landed like a slap. How long? She did not turn around. Could not. How long have you been? The word escaped her. Investigating. Managing. Controlling. All of them applied. None of them were sufficient. Since the wedding. Since the wedding, he had been picking apart the wreckage of her first marriage from the very beginning, and she had known nothing, had suspected nothing, had been once again a woman whose life was being arranged by someone else's hands. She turned. He looked tired. The same exhaustion from the study carried into daylight. His coat was buttoned with its usual severity this morning, his cravat tied with mathematical precision, but the shadows beneath his eyes betrayed him. "You should have told me." "Told you what?" His tone carried an edge she recognized, defensive, anticipating attack. "That your late husband's creditors have been circling for months, that 3 of them attempted to bring suit against you personally before I intervened, that the townhouse in Mayfair was mortgaged twice over, and the only reason you were not turned out before the funeral was that no one could determine which bank held the superior claim." Each fact landed like a stone dropped into water. She absorbed them, catalogued them, added them to the architecture of humiliations she had thought complete. "I knew he had debts." "You knew he had debts the way one knows the sea has waves. You did not know, could not have known, the scope of what he concealed from you, and you decided I should not know the scope of what you were doing about it." The accusation hung between them. Octavian moved past her into the room, gathering the papers with movements that betrayed agitation despite their efficiency. "I decided," he said, "that burdening you with the details of a mess you did not create served no purpose. The debts are being cleared. The creditors have been satisfied or will be. By Christmas there will be nothing left of Lord Langley's financial disasters but closed accounts and paid solicitors. By Christmas." "Yes, and I would have discovered this when?" He paused. His back was to her now, his hands full of evidence of his interference. "When it was finished, when there was nothing left to worry about. When there was nothing left for me to do but thank you." He turned at that. His expression, the one he kept so carefully controlled, flickered. "Gratitude was not my aim." Then what was? The question came out harder than she intended. Louder. She heard her own voice and did not recognize it. The rasp sharpened into an edge that sounded impossibly like anger. She had not been angry in years. She had forgotten she knew how. "What exactly were you hoping to accomplish?" She stepped into the room, drawn forward by the unfamiliar fire building beneath her ribs. "Clearing debts I did not ask you to clear. Investigating a marriage you had no part in. Reading letters I never intended anyone to see. You speak of burdens, of protecting me from worry, but what you have actually done is make every decision about my circumstances without consulting me once. Do you understand how that feels? Do you have any conception?" She stopped. The words had carried her too far, too fast. She was breathing hard. Her hands, she realized, had curled into fists at her sides, nails pressing crescents into her palms. Octavian set the papers down. "I understand," he said quietly, "that you spent 5 years with a man who made every decision about your circumstances. I understand that the last thing you want is another husband who behaves the same way. Then why—" "Because I am not him." The words came out sharp, almost angry, and then he seemed to hear himself. He stepped back, straightened his shoulders, rebuilt his composure brick by careful brick, and she watched him do it with a despair she could not name. "You are not," she agreed. Her voice had gone flat. "He enjoyed my helplessness. You are merely comfortable with it." The shot landed. She saw it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands stilled on the papers. "That is not, is it not?" She moved to the table, gathering her skirts to slide into the chair she should have occupied for breakfast, the chair he had covered with evidence of his good intentions. "You married me to own what belonged to your enemy. Those were the terms. I accepted them because I had no alternative. But somewhere in these weeks, you have convinced yourself that managing my affairs is kindness, that keeping me ignorant is protection, that making choices for me is somehow different from what he did because your motives are purer. My motives? Pity." The word came out like a knife. "That is what this is, you pity me. The sad little widow who did not even know the extent of her own degradation. And you have spent all this time quietly tidying up my disasters so that I might never have to face them myself. That is not pity. Then what is it?" The question filled the room. Octavian stood very still. The morning light through the windows caught his profile, turned him into carved stone rather than living flesh. She waited for him to answer, to explain, to give her anything other than quiet and good intentions and the suffocating weight of obligations she had never agreed to carry. He said nothing. Isolde rose from the chair. Her legs were steadier than they should have been, given how violently her pulse was hammering at her throat. "Thank you," she said, "for clearing the debts. I am certain your solicitors were very thorough." She walked past him to the door. "Isolde," her name in his voice. The first time he had used it without her title attached. She stopped, did not turn. "I cannot do this," she said to the doorframe, to the corridor beyond, to anyone but him. "I cannot be grateful and furious at once. I cannot untangle what you have done from why you did it. I thought—" She stopped. "I thought you might be different. I thought you might see me. I thought this impossible arrangement might become a thing I could survive. I was wrong," she finished, and left him standing in the breakfast room surrounded by the paper ruins of her first marriage. The hours passed in the manner of a fever, too slow, too fast, and impossible to track with any reliability. Isolde retreated to her chambers, dismissed her maid with a headache as excuse, sat in the window seat overlooking the garden where, only days before, she had stood close enough to him to count the threads in his waistcoat and tried to remember how to breathe evenly. She had been angry. The realization kept circling back, startling her each time. She had raised her voice. She had accused him of pity, of treating her as Langley had treated her, and she had meant it, had felt the words building in her chest like pressure against a dam, and had let them break through. And now she was sitting alone in her room, and he was somewhere in this vast house, and the fragile architecture of their understanding lay in splinters on the breakfast room floor. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. "You pity me." Had she meant it? The question turned in her mind like a key in a rusted lock. She had spent so long being managed by her father, by Langley, by the creditors who circled after his death like carrion birds waiting for the body to cool. Every kindness she had received in her adult life had come with conditions attached. Every protection had been a cage dressed in velvet. Octavian's investigations felt like more of the same. His careful clearing of debts, his quiet conversations with solicitors, his assumption that she needed to be shielded from the ugliness of her own circumstances. It was considerate, certainly. Generous, even. But it was not what she had asked for, and it was not. She made herself think the thought clearly, painfully. It was not fair to compare him to Langley. Langley had enjoyed her ignorance, had cultivated it deliberately, keeping her in the dark, not to protect her, but to control her. Every time she had asked about finances, he had laughed and told her not to worry her pretty head. Every time she had ventured an opinion on household matters, he had found ways to remind her that she was merely decorative, a possession, a thing to be arranged, not consulted. Octavian had not laughed at her, had not dismissed her. He had simply acted, made decisions, solved problems she had not known existed, because he thought she could not handle knowing, or because he thought she should not have to. The distinction mattered. She was not certain which one was true. A knock at her door. She straightened, pressed her hands to her cheeks to check for traces of tears. There were none. She had not cried, and called permission to enter. It was only a housemaid, bringing the tea she had not requested. The girl set the tray down with careful precision, bobbed a curtsy, and retreated before Isolde could ask who had sent it. The tea was prepared exactly as she preferred it. Leaves she recognized from a specific shop in Bond Street that she had mentioned once, weeks ago, in passing conversation with Mrs. Aldridge. She stared at the cup for a long time before she drank it. Dinner was a silent affair. The Dowager had other engagements, which meant Isolde and Octavian sat alone at opposite ends of the long mahogany table, the candelabra between them casting shadows that made the distance seem even greater. 20 feet of polished wood and silver service and things they could not say. He had changed for dinner. Fresh coat, immaculate cravat, not a hair out of place, but he ate mechanically, without apparent pleasure, and he did not look at her except when the footman required direction. Isolde pushed her food around her plate and thought about the tea. About the book he had left for her last week, a volume of natural philosophy she had mentioned wanting to read, appearing on her writing desk without explanation. About the way he had begun joining her in the drawing room after dinner, sitting with his own book while she worked her needlepoint, neither of them speaking, but both of them present. About the way he had said her name this morning, Isolde. Not Lady Ashford, not the Duchess, just her name, stripped of everything formal, and she had walked away from it. The footmen cleared their plates, offered dessert. Both declined. "I will be in the study," Octavian said, rising. "Do not wait up." It was the most he had said to her in 8 hours. Isolde watched him go. The straight line of his back, the tension in his shoulders that she had learned to read over the past weeks, the way he paused at the doorway, just for a moment, barely perceptible, before continuing into the corridor. She sat alone at the empty table, surrounded by the detritus of a meal neither of them had tasted, and felt the weight of her own words pressing down like a physical thing. "You pity me." But that was not quite right, was it? Pity was detached. Pity was comfortable. Pity did not stay up late investigating debts. Pity did not notice which tea a woman preferred, or which books she wanted to read, or the way her hands moved when she was anxious. Pity did not say her name like that, like it meant anything. She rose from the table. Sleep would not come. Isolde lay in her bed, the bed she had occupied alone for these months, the bed that felt increasingly like a tomb, and listened to the house settle around her. Creaking floorboards, the distant chime of a clock, the October wind testing the windows, finding the gaps where the cold air crept through. She had been cruel this morning. The realization, the morning arrived without ceremony. Isolde had slept in fragments, their arguments circling through the dark hours like birds refusing to land. She had called him controlling. His shoulders had drawn back as though she had struck him. She had meant every syllable. She had also meant something beneath the accusation, something her mind kept sliding away from, and that slipperiness had chased her through restless dreams until grey light crept beneath the curtains. She descended to the breakfast room at 8:30, later than her custom, expecting to find it empty. Octavian was there. He rose when she entered, that automatic courtesy again, the one that seemed to surprise him each time it escaped. But today he did not sit back down. Today he remained standing, and there was a different quality to the line of his shoulders. Not defensive, not armored in the way she had grown accustomed to reading. Resolved, she thought, and her hands went cold despite the fire crackling in the grate. "I need to show you something," he said. No greeting, no pleasantries about the weather or inquiries after her rest. Just that, plain and direct. "Your Grace, Octavian." The correction came quietly, but it stopped her speech as effectively as a shout. "After last night, I think we are past titles." She did not know what to do with that. She did not know what to do with any of this. The way he was looking at her, the tension in his frame, the leather folio she only now noticed clutched in his left hand, his knuckles white against the dark binding. "What is that?" He crossed to her, close, closer than he had ever willingly stood. Coffee and fresh ink reached her. The sharp smell of documents newly signed, of decisions made before dawn. "The deed to the Mayfair townhouse," he said. "Langley's townhouse, the one with the competing mortgages." Isolde's chest tightened. "You said those would be settled by Christmas." "I settled them last week." He held the folio out. "This arrived this morning. The property is free and clear." She did not take it. Her fingers refused to close around the leather when she could not see the shape of whatever game they were playing now. "And you're showing me this because you want my thanks after all," she said, and her own voice came out edged with a bitterness that startled her. "Despite what I said last night." "No." He set the folio down on the breakfast table with the care one might give to spun glass. Then he reached into his coat and withdrew a second document, smaller, the paper cream-colored and heavy. "I'm showing you this," he said, "because I had the deed transferred into your name, only yours. I have no claim to it, no access to it. If you choose to sell it tomorrow and use the proceeds to sail to America, I have no legal standing to prevent you." The words arrived at her ears in proper order, subject, verb, object, but the meaning scattered like startled birds, refusing to land. "I don't understand." "I know." He exhaled, and for the first time since she had entered the room, his composure showed cracks. A muscle worked along his jaw. His grip on the second document tightened enough to crease the expensive paper. "Last night you accused me of being comfortable with your helplessness. You were right, I was. It was—" He stopped, began again. "It was easier, having you dependent on my goodwill. It meant I never had to wonder if you stayed because you wanted to." Her throat had closed around a splinter. "Octavian, I am giving you what Langley never did." The words came faster now, rougher, forced through some barrier that had stood too long. "The ability to leave, completely, with resources and independence and no obligation to me whatsoever." He extended the second document. She took it this time, her fingers brushing his in the exchange, a shock of warmth through her gloves that made her breath hitch. The deed of transfer, signed and witnessed, her name inscribed in careful legal script. Isolde Montague, Duchess of Ashford. Not Isolde Langley, Not even Isolde Whitmore. The name she had taken when she married him, given back to her now as if it were hers to keep or shed like an old coat. The arrangement was a year, she whispered. 12 months, you said. Then a quiet separation. Yes. This ends the arrangement. Yes. She looked up at him. He was watching her with an expression she had never witnessed. Not guarded, not controlled, not the careful blankness he wore like chainmail. This was raw. This was fear, she realized, with a jolt that traveled the length of her spine. He was afraid of what she would choose. You're giving me the power to destroy you, she said. If I took this and left, if I spoke to the right people, the Duke who married his enemy's widow and couldn't keep her, they would call you a monster. They might. They would certainly call you a fool. That, he said, and the ghost of a smile flickered across his face before vanishing. They have been calling me since November 1813. I find I have developed a tolerance. Isolde set the deed down on the table beside the folio. She did not look at it again. She looked at him, at the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of his own sleepless night, at the hope he was trying so desperately to suppress, at the man who had spent 3 months guarding her from a distance because he did not know how to do it any closer. You read my letter, she said. Yes, you know I married you hoping to be understood, not rescued. I do now. Then you understand. She took a step toward him. Another. Close enough now that she could see the exact moment his chest stopped moving. I do not want a man who keeps me safe. I want a man who trusts me enough to let me be unsafe. She reached up. Her fingers touched his jaw. Just touched. The lightest contact. And he went utterly still. A statue carved from something warmer than marble. Isolde. I am choosing to stay, she said. Not because I have nowhere else to go, because you finally gave me somewhere else. And I am choosing you instead. The kiss, when it came, was not gentle. It was not the restrained, correct contact of a society marriage. It was 3 months of careful distance collapsing, the culmination of every loaded glance and unfinished sentence. His hand came up to cradle the back of her head, fingers threading through the pins that held her hair, and she tasted coffee and ink, and the terrifying promise of a future neither of them had mapped. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unevenly, Isolde laughed. The sound startled them both. Bright, unfamiliar, a little wild. She pressed her hand to her mouth as if she could catch it and put it back. Sorry, she managed. I haven't... It's been years since I... Octavian laughed too. It was rusty and strange and clearly cost him effort, but it was real. It was the first genuine laughter she had ever heard from him, and it transformed his face into a younger version, a lighter one, a man who looked almost like the brother Edmund must have known before everything broke. The arrangement is over, he said. Yes. He took her hand, lifted it to his lips, kissed her knuckles with a formality that should have felt absurd after what had just passed between them, but instead felt like a vow. Then perhaps, he said, the marriage can finally begin. 6 months later, at breakfast, Isolde would laugh at a remark he made about the garden renovation, an architectural pun so dreadful she threatened to have him committed, and Octavian would laugh in response without thinking, without the rust and the cost, as naturally as drawing breath. The Dowager Duchess, passing the breakfast-room door, would pause just long enough to hear it. She would not enter. She would not comment. But that evening, she would summon the clockmaker who had been asking after the blue drawing-room timepiece for 11 years. It was time, she would tell him, for things to start working again. This story is a work of fiction, inspired by historical settings. All characters, events, and situations are fictional and created for entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real people or actual events is purely coincidental.
There was a clock that never moved, frozen in a life we never chose. Two strangers bound by a broken truth, living in a house that no one knows.
You wore your silence like a shield, I wore my anger like a crown. But in the space we never healed, something soft was breaking down.
I saw you in the quiet, in every glance you tried to hide.
And somehow in the darkness
you became my other side.
silence broke, that's where I found you.
In the words we never spoke,
Still somehow true.
we were never meant to be,
But here we are instead.
in the ghost of what we lost.
We found love in the wreckage.
A letter never meant to be read.
A truth buried in the past.
You carried all that weight alone.
But I was blind, too proud to ask.
Now every wall is falling down,
Every doubt begins to fade.
and in the ruins of what we were,
Something real is finally made.
I feel you in the silence,
Not the emptiness we knew before,
but something warm and reckless,
like a life worth fighting for.
where the silence broke,
That's where I found you.
in the words we never spoke.
Still somehow true.
We were never meant to be,
But here we are instead. In the ghost of what we lost, we found love in the wreckage.
if you walk away,
I'll understand,
but I won't pretend, I won't break.
if you choose to stay, take my hand.
This time I won't hesitate. Where the silence broke,
Where the silence broke,
we became something
more than all the hurt we hold.
more than suffering.
Now I see you clearly,
Not the past we couldn't save,
but the love that rose from ashes.
from every scar we gave.
The clock starts ticking again, and this time